Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for a transatlantic discussion on the status of the fight against ISIS. My name is Jumana Qadour, and I'm the head of the Syria portfolio here at the Atlantic Council. Before beginning, I want to make a few general announcements. Please note that this event is public and on the record, and we invite you to follow the Atlantic Council Syria work by checking our website or following us on Twitter at AC Mideast and the hashtag Future of ISIS. We'll begin our event today with some general questions for our speakers, and after that, I'm going to take some questions from the audience. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function, and please include your name and affiliation. I'd like to now introduce our esteemed guests. Our first panelist is Mr. Chris Meyer, Director of the Defeat ISIS Task Force in the U.S. Department of Defense. He has led the task force since its inception in March 2017. Prior to this position, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. He also held a number of positions at the National Counterterrorism Center and the National Security Council staff as the Director for Counterterrorism. Next, we're joined by Ambassador Robert Rode, the German ambassador for the negotiations on Syria and head of the Division for Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Anti-ISIS Strategy. Previously, he was the spokesperson and head of the Press and Public Diplomacy Department at the German Embassy in Moscow. And prior to that, he served as Deputy Head of Defense and Security Policy Division at the German Federal Foreign Office. And finally, we're joined by my colleague, Jasmine El-Gamal, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she focuses on transatlantic Middle East policy. Previously, she served as a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and as a Middle East advisor and special assistant in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy during the Obama administration. Thank you all for being here with us today. The United States, along with a coalition of over 70 allies, has seen tremendous progress in the fight against ISIS over the last several years. The group has officially lost its capital, and much of its actual territory has been recaptured by us and our partners on the ground. The leader of the group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has also been eliminated. Thousands of ISIS fighters have been captured and are in prisons in northeast Syria. However, the group still poses a real threat to the interests of the United States and our allies, especially our European allies that have been the subject of attacks and bombings by the group, including as well as Syrians and Iraqis on the ground. This is why the Defeat ISIS campaign remains one of our top justifications for US presence in Syria. About 750 of our troops remain in northeast Syria and 10 border crossing along the Syrian-Iraqi border, where ISIS continues to launch low-intensity attacks and attempts to regroup its forces. It has become clear, though, that addressing the ISIS threat must go hand in hand with a plan for the day after defeat, and that is where looking at root causes, as well as addressing the question of Syria's stability and future, come into play. I'd like to now jump into the conversation. I want to start off first by turning to Mr. Mayer. Mr. Mayer, as the director of the de-ISIS campaign, can you give us a rundown of where we are today with regards to the fight against ISIS? Are we close to achieving victory against the group? And would a US troop drawdown in northeast Syria that we keep hearing about impact the ability to achieve such a victory?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for pulling together this important forum. I think this is a great opportunity to take stock of where we are. And as you describe it, we're focused, I know, here on mostly on Syria, but ISIS is a global threat, and we think that some of its strength that still remains. Just to give you a quick sense of how we assess the threat, we do still see ISIS having capabilities from the perspective of an insurgency. It's attempting to regroup and looking for opportunities. It's a little bit like water that flows to the lowest point. So we've seen ongoing efforts by the group, even though it's been heavily degraded, no longer controls territory, to fill into places where it can exploit things like you describe as root causes. We would say underlying conditions, these things that don't have an inherent military solution to that. I think, as you highlighted, we've made tremendous progress since 2018 or since 2014 to this day, with over 8 million people that were once under ISIS control now freed, over 110,000 kilometers of territory liberated. But we do face significant challenges. I think the interesting effort that ISIS has attempted to do to maintain combat power by having many of its fighters, including other women and children and others associated with the organization, the movement, be imprisoned as Baghouz fell is a critical challenge we will confront here. The definition we will use consistently here from the Department of Defense, and I think on the behalf of the rest of the U.S. government, is enduring defeat. In a nutshell, that means that local forces are capable of dealing with the threat on their own or with limited outside help. So I think as we continue to pursue a by, with, and through strategy, and in northeast Syria, that's principally done through the Syrian Democratic Forces, and also in some cases through other vetted Syrian groups. That's really the key to success here. We need to move up that chain from security, which is incredibly important in a society that's suffered under the scourge of ISIS, but then move into the ability to provide more stabilization so basic human needs are met. We think we're doing pretty well on that in both Syria and Iraq. But then that really significant jump to governance and really some of the things that need to be brought to bear to get at those underlying conditions that we know ISIS and other extremist groups exploit. I'll stop there and welcome your follow-up questions.
Sure. No, I appreciate you bringing up the SDF. Related to this is obviously the tension that we have seen that has led to direct violence between the SDF and Turkey. And there has no doubt been some impact on the fight against ISIS. Can you talk to us a little bit about where those talks stand? And relatedly, what is the US doing in order to stabilize governance in areas where our partners on the ground fighting ISIS are present?
So I think it's well known that we talk to Turkey, our NATO ally, probably every hour of every day, not always about this issue, but the issue of Northeast Syria is certainly a major one in our conversations. I think to answer your fundamental question, we see the SDF differently than Turkey, but we've managed to work through that. It's obviously something that we continue to work at. That's more the purview of the diplomats, but obviously we have military to military contacts. On the second part of your question about the role of the SDF in, if you might say, transitioning from primarily a military force, clearing territory, which was of course the first order of business, to more of an organization now doing governance. I think that continues to be a work in progress. I think we're clear-eyed about this, but I think we're also cautiously optimistic as we look at it. If you look at the SDF, which was set up initially to really defeat ISIS on the battlefield, there's been a transition in northeast Syria to civil councils, basic governance. Obviously, there's major challenges. We, as the U.S. government, are working as best we can, and the coalition of, as you mentioned, it's 82 countries and entities is critical here as well in bolstering the stabilization capabilities the SDF has. So a lot of that support does not come from the U.S., does not come from U.S. taxpayers. It's coming from coalition contributions to the implementers in the field, many of whom are not extensions of their government, many of whom are NGOs and others who are working directly with the SDF. But going back to my sort of frame at the beginning of moving beyond just the security piece, which of course was critical, to then the stabilization pieces and the governance pieces, is I think where we are on balance here in northeast Syria at this moment.
Great, thank you. I had one last follow-up, and this is, the past week we've seen a lot of attacks by ISIS on regime forces, and it's been, publicly available information. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Are we interacting with the Russians on this issue, with regard to ISIS? Any light you can shed?
So I think we've seen the same of more attacks against regime forces. And the ironic aspect of this, right, is where ISIS was strongest, in many respects, they're the least strongest now in that northeast area, where they've been able to continue to persist and in some cases grow, has been in those areas where the regime with their Russian partners has claimed that they've cleared them out, yet still continue to operate, claiming things like counterterrorism being the main driver of airstrikes and others. Fundamentally, I think as we look at the problem, we see the same, if not worse, conditions in some of these regime-held areas, and that's just oxygen for insurgency like ISIS. So that's really where I think the core challenge is going to be longer term, not in the areas where our partners are now quite capable, there will still be challenges there, but where we're likely to see ISIS and Al Qaeda, we can't forget about them, continue to have some ability to influence and project powers from those areas where those underlying conditions and lack of pressure continue to persist, principally in regime held areas.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'd like to now turn to Ambassador Rhoda, if I may. Ambassador Rhoda, I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about the German government's increased presence and activity in Northeast Syria. The Europeans may not have a true presence, but they're increasingly playing a role, especially in diplomacy in Northeast Syria. What role is the German government, as well as other European partners, if you don't mind me asking, playing in Northeast Syria in addressing governance issues that are at the heart of that region's stability?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon. In Germany, it's already evening. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for organizing this very timely debate with this expert panel. And I'm happy to participate. Maybe in the beginning, I would add my voice to what has been said by Chris. I mean, it's very true. I mean, ISIS lost territory, is not anymore able to conduct large-scale operations. However, I mean, continues to be a major challenge and a major threat, especially in Syria and Iraq. And we have to be vigilant, and we have, I mean, to be firm in our commitment within the coalition in the fight and the lasting defeat of Daesh, especially in Iraq and Syria. And the COVID pandemic is an additional challenge. So we cannot allow Daesh to take benefit out of this security vacuum and risk the gains made by the coalition in the last couple of years. And in this respect, allow me to welcome the continuation of the US-Iraqi strategic dialogue, which takes place, I think, in parallel, almost in parallel with our discussion, or at least tomorrow, because it's very important. It is essential, I mean, that the views of the coalition are reflected in this dialogue with Iraq. And I mean, at least, I mean, for my government, I can say that we are willing to continue our steadfast support of all the coalition efforts. Turning to Syria, I mean, you rightly mentioned, I mean, that the focus is clearly on stabilization and northeast Syria. I mean, in Syria, lasting defeat of terrorism and a normalization comes certainly first and foremost with a political process, with a political solution under the framework of the UN. But this is a different story. Maybe we have time to talk about later on this. But military gains, especially in the east of or northeast of Syria, can only be consolidated if stabilization focuses both on the damage which has been inflicted by Daesh, but also, as Chris mentioned, to address the root causes of the conflict, which led to the surge of the organization. So I think, I mean, Germany is a strong contributor in the Northeast, and we are planning to develop and expand our support, basically, I mean, to livelihoods and civil society programming. But I mean, we have an additional focus to support local communities. De-radicalization and reintegration is a very daunting task, and we do this in close cooperation with also with US implementers and through the framework or within the framework of the Syria Reconstruction Trust Fund. This is a tool. I mean, the Syria Recovery Trust Fund is a tool which remains or which allows or finances large-scale stabilization projects in the northeast of Syria. And this also includes improving living conditions, because you mentioned it, within the IDP camps or prison facilities, because I mean, perspectives for reintegration and de-radicalization are important. And this considers, I mean, psychosocial support, education, access to vocational training, and all the other aspects. So I stop here, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador. So I'd like to now turn to a question that's a bit more, has been a very sensitive one, I think, on the international scene, and that is the question of European foreign fighters. Can you talk to us a little bit about this? There's reports from Al Hol camp in northeast Syria have shown that foreign fighters are active in the camp. I know that the European countries are not necessarily united in their position. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are European plans for these European citizens that are in prison and are constantly at risk of escaping?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, as I stressed, I mean, the situation in the camps and in the prison facilities is very poor for security and humanitarian reasons. I mean, if you ask for the foreign terrorist fighters, I cannot speak about a European solution because it's not a European question. It's first and foremost a national issue. So, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It's a case-by-case study. And as you mentioned, it's a very sensible one. So we have to balance, I mean, also with internal security problems as a state of law. We have to see, I mean, if there's evidence, there are security reasons. So what we are doing is, I mean, we are trying, I mean, to give support to the living conditions, to medical facilities in order to improve the living conditions within the facilities. For us, it's important that, I mean, these prisoners are held safe and securely. And have, I mean, according to the international standards, etc. And I mean, when it comes to repatriation, it's a very sensitive issue. I mean, you know that, I mean, we last year we repatriated children, orphans, and sick children. But I mean, for the moment, I cannot tell you more about this. But I mean, there is a discussion underway.
Okay. Thank you. I have one last question for you, Ambassador, if I may. As you're aware, that next week on August 24th, the UN facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee will be meeting in Geneva. What expectations does the German government and possibly other European countries have about the possible outcome of the committee at this point? What can or should be done in order to utilize this process to achieve political objectives of Europe and the United States?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's not a surprise that we welcome the upcoming CC meeting next week. I mean, I think it's the second meeting in personal. I mean, the last being in December of last year, and then we haven't seen any meeting for approximately 10 months now. So,
this should be the third round, Ambassador.
The third round, but yeah. I mean the second meeting, because the first was a convening, and yes. So yesterday, I mean, we had a discussion within the small group with Jim Jeffrey and Joel Rayburn, and I mean, it's not a surprise that we don't have any overwhelming optimism, or I mean, we expect a breakthrough next week. So the meeting in itself is already a success, because I mean, it's more symbolic than I mean we expect already concrete outcome. I mean, if the meeting takes more than a week, and if it's not getting stuck by procedural questions as last time, and they get to discuss into substance, it's a good confidence building exercise. So I think, I mean, we shouldn't expect a new constitution or a revised constitution within the next weeks or months. And I mean, the resolution 2254, which is at the heart of a political solution, talks about also other things than a constitution. I mean, we have the question of detainees and missing persons. We have upcoming elections, etc. So it's more a door opener for a political process, I mean, which gives maybe impetus to discuss also other topics under the resolution. But I mean, the meeting in itself, and I mean, and I don't know if you heard, I mean, the speech of Assad last week. I mean, at least he mentioned, even ironically, he mentioned the political process. I mean, Assad, who never touched upon political process. I wouldn't say it's a change, but at least it's maybe due to Russian pressure, at least the signal, I mean, that the regime is coming next week to Geneva and is willing at least to engage. Remains to be seen what will be followed, but I mean, the fact in itself, we welcome it.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Jasmine, I'd like to turn to you now. You recently finished a report with Hani Magali for the United Nations and New York University on root causes of ISIS. Congratulations, first of all. We very much look forward to seeing the entirety of the report. Could you talk to us a little bit about, your major findings of this report that may help us understand, how to eradicate conditions to prevent future ISIS resurgence, which I believe was the primary sort of question you were looking at in this report?
Right. Thank you so much for having me, first of all, and it's a pleasure to be here with Chris and Ambassador Rode. So a couple of things. Yes, the report that is about to come out, it was for the UN ESQA in cooperation with New York University, and we very much look forward to sharing it when it comes out, which should be in the next couple of months. What I will talk about now is not just what was in the report. I'll briefly mention some things that were in the report, but generally speaking, based on the 5 or so years that I spent at the Pentagon working on the Syria file and really being there during the Arab Spring when it first started, and then with the rise of ISIS, and then later on after leaving the Pentagon, kind of doing this research with the ground, talking to Syrians who had been affected by everything that we were doing while I was at the Pentagon, and looking at the whole thing from a lessons learned perspective as well. So I want to make a couple of overarching points, Jomana, and then maybe we can go into it in the Q&A further or through your questions. The first is that I'm really happy to hear both of my co-panelists actually talk about the importance of an enduring defeat of ISIS and of stabilization, and the fact that this isn't just a military battle. Those are all really important points. But the really important thing to note while we're talking about the enduring defeat of ISIS is to note that a lot of the, if not most, if not all of the underlying conditions that led to the rise of ISIS, which I'll go into very, very shortly, remain. They are still there in Syria. They may have taken a different shape or form, or it may be a different actor that's aggravating those conditions, but the underlying conditions are still there and have not yet been fully addressed. And the main part of that is that the main factor that led to the rise of those conditions, which is the Syrian regime itself, remains in place and remains a highly aggravating factor. So that's just a point that I wanted to make up front. The second point is when we talk about ISIS, the defeat of ISIS and what led to the rise of ISIS, I agree, and yes, it's not a military fight only, but it's important to remember that the road to ISIS was paved with a violent armed group, and that all led to a culmination of the largest group of all, which is ISIS. And I say this to remind us all that even if ISIS as an organization is to be defeated, the fact is that violent extremism and violent extremist organizations still have the opportunity to take hold in Syria because of those underlying factors that are still there. So let me just mention 2 or 3 of them quickly, Jomana, and then we can go into them as you wish. The first one, obviously, is authoritarianism. And this is authoritarianism, I'm talking about years and years of built-up authoritarianism that started with Hafiz al-Assad before the current president, Bashar al-Assad, continued, and now especially with northeast Syria, with the autonomous administration being in power, seeing them repeat some of the mistakes, whether even if it's inadvertently, that previous rulers had in the northeast, whether it was under the regime or under ISIS, that have gleams of authoritarianism, whether it's not including Arabs fully in the decision-making processes in the local councils, or whether it's kind of framing the SDF as a fully Kurdish organization that does all the heavy lifting when it comes to the fight against ISIS. I think it's important to remember that these twin factors of authoritarianism and exclusionism are still very much there, again, whether even if it's inadvertently under the SDF. The second thing that I wanted to talk about, I think that was important, is the discipline and the power and the structure that ISIS brought to the Northeast and to its recruiting efforts was a major factor that we heard again and again from Syrians as to what made them decide to join or to pick up arms or even to not fight them, or to kind of, accept, if accept is the wrong word, but to not proactively try to fight them. Because at some point, people in the Northeast, and I think this applies to a lot of places where ISIS was able to take hold, even in Iraq, which we've mentioned before. The fact is that people waking up day after day with no sense of their future, no sense of stability, no sense of certainty, at some point leads them to say, just tell me what's happening in my life tomorrow, and I'll do it, and I'll follow you, but just tell me. And so I think that sense of uncertainty is very much still there, and insecurity, and that's something that should be addressed as well. And finally, and I'll stop here, related to that, what was good about what we found, and what I've learned through, from basically working on Syria since 2010, is that ideology actually is not a significant factor, has not been, and currently is not a significant factor in why people, whether it was joined ISIS or did not significantly fight ISIS. Time and time again, in talking to people about why they picked up arms or why they didn't choose to fight ISIS, it was about very practical, almost just very practical, very basic decision making. Who is going to pay me the most? Who is going to tell me about my future? Who is going to secure my family from the enemy of today and the enemy of tomorrow? We really rarely came up with someone who said yes because I believed in their ideology. So I think that's also, it's a good news story. It's an important point, I think, to remember in the counter ISIS efforts that we're working on moving forward. So it's a lot to unpack, and I know I'm talking a bit quickly to fit it all in, but over to you.
Sure. I had one follow-up question that kind of blends your previous hat at DoD with your, current researcher role on this report. And that's, our response in Northeast Syria, it as we've all, agreed here, it's insufficient so far. The job is not done. ISIS still remains a threat, but and this is something that I asked Mr. Mayor in the beginning, but the talk of a drawdown does continue. We keep hearing reports that by the end of the year, our troops may be out of Syria and Iraq that are assigned to address the fight against ISIS. But from your vantage point, what do we need to make sure needs to be done and addressed before our troops walk away?
You broke up just in those very last few words.
Sure, yeah, sorry about that. I said, from your vantage point, what do we need to make sure is addressed before the United States and the coalition walks away?
Right. Great question. And I think it's very difficult to kind of weigh the disadvantages or the cons of having a foreign presence in the Northeast. Just like, let's say we're talking about the Northeast right now. The damage that does, weighing it with the advantages that it does have in the fight against ISIS, and trying to manage those expectations. Really being very clear about the fact that whether it's the US or Germany or NATO or any other foreign force, is not responsible and cannot be responsible for being there forever to fix the issues, but having the responsibility because of where we've come and the role that they've played in where we've come so far. So I guess I'll just say two, I think, main things that we should really be cognizant of as international actors before we consider a full drawdown of foreign troops. And I think the first thing is twin efforts. One is the communication aspect, which is just as important as the physical aspect. So really communicating. What we found time and time again in talking to people in the Northeast is just utter confusion over what the policy was and why foreign troops were still there and what they were doing and whether it even had anything to do with Syrians in the first place. So I think just having that communication, that strategic communication aspect, bolstering that and being really clear about what foreign troops are doing and why would be really helpful to the second point that I'm about to make, which is really kind of understanding and respecting the dynamics on the ground, understanding who the local actors are, and really respecting the fact that local actors want to be involved in local solutions. So even if we're helping out as an international community in putting forth those solutions, we have to recognize there are not just Kurds in Syria, there are Arabs in Syria, there are Christians, there are, there are minority communities. I mean, where do all of those, what role do they play in the future of their country? And doing it in a way that is not, whether advertently or inadvertently sectarian. So not talking about the Kurds and the Arabs, but talking about the Syrians of the community, the local population, and what role they want to have, to hear from them and include their voices in the solution. So those are the two main points I think we should be very cognizant of.
Great. Thank you, Jasmine. Okay, so we have a series of questions, and I think a lot of them are really good questions. So let me go ahead and dive into some of those. The first one is for Mr. Mayor, from Roger Phillips. So he says, there have been reports of attempted prison breaks at SDF prisons. What kind of enduring solution does the coalition forces foresee for ISIS detainees? Should the 2,000 foreign fighters be repatriated, and what should be done with the remaining 8,000 in SDF prisons?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, very comprehensive. So I'll try to give a very brief answer to what is probably the most enduring challenge as we look at, long-term generational here with the de-ISIS fight in Syria in particular. So I think, and the ambassador alluded to it, what you've heard from the United States is repatriation is really what we would like to see countries of origin do. Of that 2,000 foreign terrorist fighters, there's about 60 countries that have citizens in those prisons, and we're not going to find a solution really in Northeast Syria exclusively. So I think the approach that we've taken and working through the coalition and other local partners there is to try to secure these individuals in the first order. Many of them are ISIS fighters who left the battlefield and are now in prison, so they have basic skills, generally have been somewhat capable soldiers, and at some level, ISIS at a large level or a leadership level would like to have those forces back on the battlefield. So securing those individuals, working again by, with, and through those that are holding them, which is the SDF. And this is probably a good point to make. The SDF are doing a service on behalf of the international community and holding 10,000 plus, not to mention those in Al-Hol that are, more of the families and others. But I think that securing piece is critical as we do two things: really ask countries to take back the citizens that they know they have there, and in some cases have turned their back on, and also at the same time look for them, not only US, but other countries, to help come up with solutions to deal with this problem long term. Because the overall fear, of course, is this becomes the next generation of an ISIS 2.0 or something perhaps more virulent.
Thank you. Ambassador Rhoda, the question now turns to you. From Sirwan Casual, he asks, the SDF-led autonomous administration in Northeast Syria has repeatedly said they would try ISIS foreign fighters locally, given that most countries so far have refused to take back their citizens. So would Germany and other European countries support such a move?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jomana. We have heard about plans of the so-called Kurdish self-administration for Daesh tribunals, but nothing in detail. So, I mean, a lot of questions remain. Applicable law, a rule of law standards, no death penalty. And I mean, you certainly know the Kurdish self-administration is not an internationally recognized entity. So a lot of questions remain. So we need more clarity in order to judge, these kind of initiatives.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to turn back over to you real quick. So recently there were major clashes between local tribes and the SDF in Deir ez-Zor. Obviously, such an environment for ISIS, this is an invitation for ISIS to be active once again in a larger scale in that area and use the local conflict to expand. What's the best solution to reduce or even eliminate the problems between the SDF and local tribes? And just to clarify, this is by Nawar Shaban from the Amran Center.
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, a very challenging problem, and I think it goes back to what I was saying of beginning to build the inclusive governance institutions that for, Syria's history, at least in the Northeast in recent times, has not existed. So we're really asking the SDF to, as best they can, be inclusive of all the people. And I think Jasmine made that point very clearly. I think it's worthwhile, though, throwing into the mix here that this would already be a hard problem if it was just local people dealing with local problems. But the Iranians, the Russians, the Syrian regime, other outside actors continue to work at counter purposes of some of that inclusivity, because they're attempting as well to exploit some of the fissures in society that ISIS has done in the past. And so I think we should be clear-eyed that in many respects, this could be a 5, 6, 7-dimensional problem that local people are having to deal with. Boy, if I had a solution that was nice and easy to answer, I think we would have implemented it already. I think there's a tremendous amount of our dialogue, though, with the SDF and local people outside that structure that is just about that inclusive governance that hopefully deals with what we all know are some of the underlying conditions, not only that ISIS, but other malign actors exploit.
Sure. Let me take this opportunity then to add a follow-up question, because I feel it's very related. So Jason Zhu from the Institute for the Study of War asked, do you worry that the ISIS threat in the Central Syrian Desert and the regime side of the Euphrates River Valley could flow over the Euphrates River and threaten SDF-held Northeast Syria?
Yeah, it's a great question. So being in the terrorism business, I worry about lots of things, and that is actually less of a concern right now, in part because of, as I said earlier, where the SDF has been successful is in that area to the east of the Euphrates, where we still have a presence, as does the coalition, in working with them. Where we've seen ISIS manifest more is actually on the opposite bank. It's on the Syrian controlled side into the Badia Desert and even back into some of the built up areas in Syria. And my concern is that's where ISIS is going to continue to take root, because as Jasmine well hit on, many of those conditions still exist. We would say from our perspective that some of those are worse than they were when the Syrian civil war began. And so that just gives again air or fuel to that ISIS fire, that they continue to exploit some of those conditions.
Great, thank you. Jasmine, I'm going to ask you a question. You didn't touch on it directly, but I know in some of your past work, you've definitely looked closer at El Hol camp. So the question is from Karen, and she's asking, what is the coalition U.S. government doing to assist rehabilitation of small children and ISIS wives and ISIS fighters in El Hol camp and the refugee, El Hol and other refugee camps? And anyone else on the panel, feel free to dive in here. But I thought, Jasmine, if you want to take a stab at answering this.
Thank you, Jamal. I'd rather actually, this isn't a cop-out, Chris, but I'd rather turn that over to you, just because you are probably much more aware of what the U.S. government is actually doing in this regard. But I will say that, just quickly, that is one of, both from my co-panelists' remarks and the questions that are like, a lot of them are about Al Hol. It is one of the things that came up time and time again. The one thing I'll say that's really been really worrying for people who are working on this issue, obviously, is the children, and that generation of children who are so deeply, scarred and are in so much need of psychosocial support and trauma support. When we talk about things, I think Ambassador Rode mentioned, the difficulties with de-radicalization efforts, that nothing actually can begin, whether it's rehabilitation physically or de-radicalization, without addressing that trauma and that psychosocial support that is needed for the children. And obviously, it begins with the children going home. So with the countries that are responsible for their citizens to take them home and start that rehabilitation process from there.
Okay. I don't know if, Chris, you wanted to add something. We keep getting questions about this issue, so I'm going to pose one last question about the prisoners, specifically as related to the U.S. position, before giving you an opportunity to answer that. But Peter Galbraith asked, is the U.S. military prepared to facilitate the repatriation of ISIS prisoners and or family members by flying people to their country of origin? Many countries say they cannot send diplomats or forces into Northeast Syria and therefore need U.S. military facilitation. So I think that will cover most of sort of the ISIS prisoners question, because we received a lot of those. But if anyone wants to touch on this, including you, Mr. Mayor, please go ahead.
So I'll go ahead and answer the direct question. I would say yes, we're willing, and we've already done this in cases, but keep in mind that this isn't only a military solution. In many cases, it requires diplomatic engagement in capitals to get countries to take back their individuals. The ambassador already talked about the judicial process. We're not going to turn individuals over to the degree that we're facilitating them to a country that isn't going to put them through a human rights-based judicial process. And so it's more of a whole of government challenge. We would gladly take on that challenge, I think, in facilitating if we had more and more of these 60 plus countries that have foreign fighters and they're willing to take them back. We can make the mechanics work. It's the political will we can't manufacture.
Great. Ambassador Rhoda, we had a question for you from Jeffrey Allen. It states, Germany is currently trying members of ISIS who are accused of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Specifically, especially those who are in the, who were formerly part of the Assad regime. The German authorities are exercising universal jurisdiction to pursue these trials. Can we have an explanation about how this is working and whether countries in the other countries in the coalition might pursue this option for purposes of trying suspects currently in custody in northern Syria?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I mean, there are trials, or basically the first trial against members of the Syrian regime in front of a court in Frankfurt, in Koblenz, near Frankfurt. But I mean, we have also tried, ISIS members and members from other militias, who committed war crimes. So it's not only related to regime officers, but it created very much a public attention. And it is because, we have this universal jurisdiction in our law system, which allows, the general prosecutor to move forward with these files. But basically, it's based on evidence and it's a first case. So, and I think we are not the only country. I think the Swedes are also having this universal jurisdiction, etc. So I'm not a legal expert. I don't know what is, the constitutional pretext for having these trials. But I think, our constitution allows it. Even if people are not having committed crimes on the territory of Germany, but if these crimes are crimes against humanity or against international humanitarian law, to prosecute them in front of German courts. And that's what we are doing.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of questions related to Turkey's role in the fight against ISIS. We have one question from Vladimir von Wilgenberg that states, is the US worried about evidence of significant ISIS leadership being present in Turkish controlled areas? 3 ISIS leaders were recently killed in airstrikes there in May. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to pick up on that question. And relatedly, there's a question from Matthew Margala about Turkey's role in contributing or exacerbating the fight against ISIS, about the ties of President Erdogan's family to some of the ISIS oil trade, etc. Does anyone want to take that from the panelists?
I'll take the basic question here. So I think Syria is complicated, of course, as everybody on this panel knows, and your audience does as well. I think it's worth keeping in mind, though, that Turkey is a member of the coalition, and Turkey is one of the few countries that has lost forces fighting ISIS. Obviously, Turkey has other national security concerns in Syria as well. And so that balance that I think we see Ankara try to strike is something that we work closely with them on. To the question of more ISIS threats in Turkish-controlled areas, we've been very open with the Turks that we have concerns at times of some of the local proxy forces they work with and whether that contributes to some of these underlying conditions getting worse. But I think it's wrong to think that Turkey is the main protagonist, inflaming ISIS tensions or other terrorist threats in the region. It's far more complicated than that, and certainly something that we engage with them on regularly. I'll stop there.
Okay, I have a question from Zahir Sahlul that says, do you think that President Biden will also look at Syria through the prism of ISIS, and what needs to be done to make policymakers address the roots of extremism, which are poor governance, human rights violations, lack of freedoms? What are we still missing? Why are we still missing that simple point and keep supporting dictators who promote extremism indirectly or directly? Jasmine, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I think that, don't hold me to this, obviously, but I think that a Biden administration would be very cognizant of, I think, the missed opportunities and the mistakes that were made while, he was serving as vice president in an Obama administration. I think, I take Chris's point. Anyone who works in government obviously knows that if anyone had the solution to any problems, I mean, they would be solved by now. And it's always difficult to do so as an external actor. But I think a lot of the mistakes that were made, whether it was early on in the conflict, whether it was not putting enough pressure diplomatically on the Russians or on the Syrian regime itself, to maybe not paying full attention to the increasing flow of foreign fighters into the region, into Syria, to everything that happened over that. And one of the first efforts that we did, major efforts, I remember from my days in the Pentagon, was the Train and Equip program, for example. Jumana, you remember this, and how one of the conditions that was placed upon people who were to receive that training and that equipment was that it would only be used for the fight against ISIS and not to fight Syrian regime forces, kind of completely bypassing the importance that the fight against the regime played in a lot of the opposition's minds. So all of these are things that I think Vice President Biden, as president, would review. Remember, a lot of his advisors who are sure to handle this portfolio in his administration were also handling it in various ways, and the Obama administration would be very cognizant. I think Tony Blinken specifically has publicly stated that they're very cognizant of these missed opportunities and that they will do a better job of addressing some of these issues in the future, keeping in mind, obviously, that these issues are very complicated. To the last question quickly about why we keep supporting dictators in the, I don't think I would take that question, but I think a President Biden would be more cognizant of the impact that has on local populations. He's spoken very strictly about situations, whether it's in Syria or Saudi Arabia or other places, that should give us a hint as to what his policies might be in the future.
Thank you. So we got a bit more, a more general question that I thought might be interesting just for us to address here, from Michelle Chi Kim, who asked specifically about the strategy and tactics that we might be employing to fight violent extremist groups from those of state actors that we're also grappling with, especially in Northeast Syria. Can any of you chime in about how does success against, violent extremist actors differ from, success against enemy states? Does that, Jasmine?
I just spoke, so I'd rather give the floor to someone one of my co-panelists.
If Mr. Mayor or the ambassador want to chime in on that question at all. No takers.
Jumana, I think it's just, just kind of, from my hat inside of government and outside of government, and from having lived in the region now for over 2 years after leaving government, a very practical, maybe unsatisfying answer to this is that the rules that govern our relationships as states with other states are very different and the rules and the restrictions that govern our actions against non-state actors. I mean, we talked a little bit about Turkey. Turkey is a very complicated actor, and it has been complicated in Syria and in other places. But the fact is, Turkey is a NATO ally, and it's a member of the coalition. And there are certain rules and things that certain avenues that we have to address those issues with states, diplomatic channels, we have embassies, we have ways in which to address those issues with states that we simply don't have the luxury of having with non-state actors. And thereby our options dealing with those actors are limited in many ways. And I think that is one of just the main complicating factors and the difference between those two.
Sure, sure. Thank you. So I had one question from Roger Phillips, and I'll leave it to whoever wants to address it. But are there concerns that the sale of oil from Northeast Syria or to or through a US company may serve to create grievances on the part of the population and create sympathies for ISIS? What could be done by the United States or other actors to remedy this problem?
So I'll touch on that. I think it's important to keep in mind that while Northeast Syria is not the oil-rich area that some other places in the Gulf and the Middle East are, oil is still a pretty important part of the livelihood there. And I think as we look at it initially from the ISIS perspective, ISIS exploited oil to fund much of its war machine at times. I think now that ISIS has largely been driven away from those facilities, we have a military mission to help secure those from ISIS. But I think what we observe is that's going to be a key to the ultimate, civil society and governance and economic benefits in that area. So from the U.S. perspective, we're cautious of how that's used to the degree to which we influence it. I think we have pushed the local authorities to be as judicious as possible in using it, but we should be aware as well that others are looking to exploit it. I think the Russians have made it pretty clear that they're looking to make inroads not for the benefit of the locals that own the oil or sit on the oil or live by the oil, but for extraction purposes. And the Assad regime certainly has viewed that oil in that same way of improving its economy, less for the people who live there. So I think as we look forward, this is likely to be a more and more prominent issue, and one that we're wise to focus on as we look at some of these underlying conditions we've all talked about now, and whether that goes in a positive direction or a negative direction.
Sure, thank you. Another question that I'll leave open to whoever wants to answer it, but from Todd Clausen at the Naval War College, who asks, you mentioned the need for stabilization operations in Syria and other locations where ISIS had hold over territory and populations. What entity do you propose to handle these stability operations?
Yes. If I may come in,
please,
Jomana, thank you very much. Yes, I mean it's a difficult question because I mean as as Jasmine also mentioned, I mean and Chris touched upon, I mean the issue of the self-administration, which lacks sometimes of inclusiveness, etc. So I mean if I can only talk about our approach to stabilization and stability efforts. I mean, we are cooperating with local communities through NGOs, etc., grassroots level, civil society actors, etc., mediation efforts between Arab tribes and Kurdish populations. So I think, I mean, in order to avoid, I mean, to work exclusively with the self-administration, because we don't have any official contacts with the self-administration. As I said, it's not an internationally recognized entity. And we have to bring, I mean, across also the local populations, because it's a local need. So, I mean, our approach is needs-based, so it has to go there, I mean, where the need is mostly felt. And that's why, I mean, we are trying to be as grassroots as possible.
Sure, thank you. So Todd had a follow-up question that's related to this about the idea of ISIS and the question of ISIS metasizing beyond just the group, beyond Syria and Iraq, and really formulating a cognate strategy based upon, that requires looking at defeating not just ISIS, but Al-Qaeda and associated movements. Do you think making those connections, Director, is helpful? And how are you, I know you briefly mentioned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in the beginning. We have a few minutes. I'd love for you to sort of tie it in and how you're seeing both of those operations that the United States is working on in Syria.
Thanks. One of the benefits I think we've had is that ISIS and its different Al-Qaeda affiliates, whether it's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or others, have not necessarily got along particularly well. I think most of the folks on this know the history and the schism that they've had. That said, we've generally not tried to paint them with the same broad brushstroke beyond the basic title of violent extremist organizations. In both cases of ISIS and elements of Al-Qaeda, they've had external operations aspirations, so we take particular focus on that. But I think it's worth looking at how the de-ISIS campaign has gone as a by with and through with a global coalition, and we haven't had to do the same for Al-Qaeda in recent years, not because it hasn't been talked about, but because the ISIS threat, both controlling territory and many of the things that they purported to do as a state were far more threatening to the United States, to our partners around the world. So I think there continues to be an element of a violent extremist nature, not only in Syria and Iraq, but elsewhere. Our job really is to take a risk-based approach to that. Is the threat pronounced that it requires certain responses on our part and the international community, or is it something that local people, governments, international organizations, regional organizations can deal with? And I think we make different calculations in different places. Syria, obviously, there's a bit of a difference here in the Northwest in particular. I mean, if there's a hot war still going on in Syria, it's been Idlib, and I think that complicates any kind of counterterrorism effort there, in part because many of the actors claim to be carrying out counterterrorism operations when in reality we know they're not. And from a U.S. perspective, we don't have the presence we have there, nor do we have the partners in the form of non-state actors to prosecute that the same way. So the tactics are different.
Sure. Thank you. I believe that those are the questions that we've received. And unless anyone else had any other comments or to add, it's been a very fruitful conversation. I really appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy day to discuss with us what I think unfortunately will still remain an issue for the remainder of the year and probably for the foreseeable future. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.